Welcome, everybody. It is great to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'll be your chat monitor today. So I'll be in the chat with you. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or use the Q&A, whatever works best for you. Today's conversation is going to be a lively and important conversation about the constitutional conventions and the questions we have about the Constitution and how it is playing out in current events today and this week. So we are so excited that we have one of our great friends, Sal Khan from Khan Academy with us today. If you don't know Khan Academy, it's one of the coolest, amazing resources and tools to teach everybody and give the best lectures and the best scholarship and the best teaching across the world so everybody can access great learning, no matter what age you are and no matter what topic you want to dive into. And we are, of course, brought here with our our CEO and president, Jeffrey Rosen, our top scholar. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and we'll begin the conversation.
Wonderful. First, let me greet Sal and say what a pleasure it is to see you. And it's such a meaningful opportunity to talk with you about the Constitution during this historic week. So Sal, welcome to the National Constitution Center's Constitutional Convention class.
Honored to be here. And you're right. You know, sometimes you get the history you want, sometimes you get the history you don't, but it's historic either way.
That's a great way to put it. You know, our partnership has been so meaningful. Together, we created these great videos about the Constitution a couple of years ago that have become such a central way of teaching the Constitution to students. And we had a great conversation a few months ago also about the importance of constitutional education. There's obviously never been a more urgently important time than this week when we saw for the first time in American history armed mobs storming the US Capitol and trying to disrupt the most basic function of our democracy, namely the certification of a presidential election. There's never been such an urgent time to study the Constitution. So before we jump in, let me just ask you your reflections about this past week and why it makes studying the Constitution all the more important.
Yeah, you know, it's obviously troubling when you turn on the news. You know, I actually try to keep in my own bubble, not watch the news too much because it can. But obviously, I started. You know, coworkers were telling me, "Hey, you got to turn on the TV." And I was like, "Wow, you know, it's obviously disturbing." I think everyone felt that way. I mean, just symbolically disturbing, especially as you mentioned, given what Congress was trying to do that day, which is like the bedrock of our democracy and trying to disrupt that. But you know, maybe I always run glass half full, or I'm an optimist. But to me, I view how it played out as really a sign that as much as we kind of got a lot of into populist words and it seemed like some mainstream folks were trying to go along with some of that, at the end of the day, our institutions held up at the end of the day. And, you know, you only know the strength of your institutions when they're tested in a very serious way. And, you know, I keep my own politics close to y'all won't be able to guess what my views on taxation and this and that. But when you have the president of the United States, you know, not so subtly encouraging people to use force to disrupt the counting of the votes, that's a pretty strong test of your institutions. And the fact that I believe it looks like the institutions have really, really held up, to me, makes me, you know, it wasn't proud visually, you know, friends, family from other countries calling me and saying, what's going on? I only thought this happened in our country or whatever. But it gives me confidence that our institutions are strong, but it's also a reminder that we have to nurture them and not take them for granted. And especially elected leaders cannot throw darts at our institutions because they're more delicate than, you know, we probably appreciate.
Beautifully said. That just crystallizes the essence of what we've learned this past week, that in the face of a dramatic test, the institutions held and the Constitution held. And this really was a reminder that, as Gerald Ford so memorably said when he took office after President Nixon's resignation, our Constitution works. We are a republic of laws and not of men. So let's use our time together. And the group is amazing. This is a phenomenal group of engaged students with excellent questions. And we can turn to some of the important constitutional issues that have arisen in this past week, ranging from the role of Congress in certifying electoral votes, to the most recently questions about the 25th Amendment for removing a president and whether presidents can be impeached at the end of their terms and so forth. But let's begin at the beginning in the Constitutional Convention, which is what we're here to focus on. And Saul, as we've talked about in our videos together, the vision of armed mobs disrupting the rule of law when they were egged on by populist demagogues is the central evil that the framers of the Constitution were determined to avoid. They had visions of Shays' Rebellion, 1787, armed debtors in Western Massachusetts mobbing the courthouses because they didn't want to pay their debts. And it was that led James Madison to write in Federalist 55, "In all large assemblies of any number, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob." So that was why they created the Constitution the way they did, to create speed bumps and guardrails, to slow down deliberation, to prevent all power from being concentrated in a kingly executive, to prevent Congress from having the power to elect the president. The Electoral College was created to deny legislative appointment and to create another guardrail of electors who would exercise filtering judgments. And then, of course, the courts, which we saw function so importantly during the past couple of weeks in rejecting false claims of electoral fraud. So what are your reflections about how prescient the framers were? They couldn't have anticipated Twitter, obviously, or social media, but they did anticipate the dangers of mobs being egged on by demagogues to populist violence, and tell us about the institutions that they created in the convention to avoid precisely that.
No, it's fascinating. I think growing up especially in the US and going to school here, you take for granted things like the Constitution and how our government is structured and things like democracy. But what you just outlined, this tension between how do you make sure that you aren't a fragmented and indecisive government that can't take action when action is needed, with at the same time not giving too much power to one central authority so that they can become a demagogue or a dictator. That had never been done before in world history, as far as, if you think about the Greek city-states and all of that, those were cities, small cities by our standards. These weren't, even the 13 colonies were large by that standard. And so it's a really tough challenge that they had to deal with. And, we take it for granted now because it's been 200 plus years that we've had these types of institutions. But I find it incredible that some folks in 1787 were able to reflect on things like Shays' Rebellion, and in a matter of 5-6 months come up with frame something that has really stood the test of time. And it's not perfect, and we've had to amend it. And one could argue that there might be more amendments that need to happen, or more ways that it could be modified. But for the most part, have stood the test of time. And to your point, stood even what happened 2 days ago. And when I think about when the word institution, I think a lot of times, at least in my head, I always imagine institutions are like, buildings with pillars. But those aren't institutions. The institutions are actually what's going on in people's heads. The reason why what didn't succeed 2 days ago is because I would say the great majority of Americans, even many Americans who might have politically agreed with the administration or politically agreed with many of the people who were protesting or rioting, really, they said, no, this is too far. You are now becoming, this is un-American. There's some neuron or set of neurons in our brain that have defined that for us. And that's where the institution really exists. If for whatever reason, a majority of us said, yeah, that's a good thing. Go in and, and storm the Capitol without trying to count votes, then that institution would fail. It's not about buildings. It's not about things written on paper. It's actually what's going on in our heads. And that's, I think, the most powerful thing.
That is such a profound and important point. Institutions are what's going on in our heads. And that is exactly what the framers meant when they talked over and over again about the necessity of self-government. They meant not only self-government politically, but self-government personally, of mastering our unreasonable and selfish passions like anger, ambition, avarice, faction, so that we could be guided by reason and serve the public interest rather than our own selfish instincts or partisan interests. And that's why the framers said over and over again that the republic would collapse without civic education. Over and over again, Jefferson, a democracy cannot survive ignorant and free. Madison, a government that isn't aware of its liberties won't defend them. And that's why you and I are such evangelists for the importance of civics. And Victoria Wilson in our chat box says, if there's a major point that can be taken from the event of the past weeks, it's that civics should be made a massive priorities. History, civics, and government are given the same level of importance and funding that STEM and STEAM programs have. In light of the past week, because I know this has been a commitment of yours for so long, why do you think that civics is especially important? And let's think about what we can do together to promote it.
Yeah, I mean, a democracy or a republic is only going to be as strong as as we said, the institutions exist in people's minds. And not only the institutions, but then how we navigate decisions. Our leaders are a reflection of us. And if we can improve our own knowledge and improve our own context of, these trade-offs between centralized power, but loss of freedoms, what freedoms are we giving to the government to protect our other freedoms, have these frameworks there. That is what's going to allow us to continue to be have strong institutions, have a strong democracy, and continue to improve as a country, be more inclusive, give more people potential, hopefully over the next 200 or 500 or 1,000 years. We can't take that for granted. When you look at, I don't know what the general level of civics education was in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention, but when you look at the conversations that the folks were having in the room, they would, at least I don't see many of our leaders having that depth today. Maybe they do. They hide it because they think it would be unpopular. I actually do think that is the case. But it would be wonderful if we forget that we're today a country of 300 something million people. That was the 13 colonies. It was not a big place. It was kind of, the United States is now a central world power, arguably the world power. But then we were, on the periphery. We recently got independence from the world power of the time. Most of the world wasn't really paying attention to what was going on in the 13 colonies. It was like, yeah, there's this little fringe group there. But yeah, that's why we've got to invest in it for people and for leaders. And I do give credit though. I actually just tweeted because I was obviously given today's topic, I was reading up a little bit, but I just tweeted from Federalist Number 1, which was written by Hamilton. It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. And that's powerful because for most of human history, it's accident and force. Which king was able to conquer which other king, and then they have dynastic rule until they have a really bad ruler or a famine hits, and then people revolt. Accident and force. And even in, my family comes from Bangladesh. My wife comes from Pakistan. A lot of accident and force in who's leading at any given point in time. And what was powerful a couple of days ago is that people were attempting a little bit of that accident and force, but I think the real reason, a reflection and choice, to use Hamilton's words, continued to win out, and I think we're strengthened because they showed that they could fight off the accident and force.
Wow, I'm so glad that you highlighted that and shared it and focused our attention on it, because that question of whether a democracy is capable of being governed by reason and deliberation rather than action and force, of course, was one that the convention was unsure about. And they were extremely well educated. They'd read the classics and Aristotle and Cicero and the moral theorists like Adam Smith and Francis Hutcheson, but they were not sure whether the masses of the people would take the time to be guided by reason and deliberation, by reason rather than passion. And after John Adams read Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, which talked about how important it is for individuals just to, on a daily basis, master their passions and be guided by public interest. He said, I just don't think the masses are capable of it. I think offices should be hereditary, basically, because otherwise we can't rely either on the people or on their representatives, who he thought would be seduced by the desire for popular opinion. And we've seen in the past couple of weeks that even extremely well-educated senators, and I'm going to call them out because I think that the Constitution requires it. When you see a Senator Josh Hawley or a Senator Ted Cruz, Supreme Court clerks, Yale law school graduates and so forth, who are very well educated, but instead giving fist bumps to the mobsters, you realize that education isn't enough, that you really need virtue in the leaders and the people, but you also need those guardrails and speed bumps, because if men were angels, Madison said, no government would be necessary, but without some virtue, no government is possible. So in light of that, what do you think is did the framework strike the right balance, counting on the people and their leaders to be virtuous in some circumstances, but also creating these speed bumps and guardrails? And do you think the speed bumps and guardrails are holding? Are they enough, or do we need to strengthen them?
I think they did an incredible job. When you think about what a constitution is, and this is something I didn't appreciate until I was frankly in my 30s or 40s. Once again, you're in school, you learn about the Constitution, you just take it for granted. Yeah, countries have constitutions. Even the fact that the word, it literally means constitute, like it defines what your government is. That took me like until I was in my 30s to, oh yeah, it's like constituting the government. That's what a constitution is. But you're starting from scratch, and everything they looked at before was essentially dynastic rule by kings, was the world in which these people were coming about. And dynastic rule by kings seemed to work in terms of at least establishing a country in terms of power. England was the dominant world power at the time. George III, dynastic rule. For them to, look at, as you mentioned, kind of the Enlightenment philosophers, and then also the kind of classical Greek and Roman philosophers, and say, no, we think we can do something different, is a radical idea. And then for them to, they had a stab at the Articles of Confederation. It was a little bit too weak, so they iterated. It's almost kind of your, Silicon Valley style. Hey, first there wasn't good product market fit the first time around. we got to iterate on this thing. So they all got into a room, and in a matter of months, produced something that, as it's mind-blowing how it stood the test of time. And at any given point in history, it's very easy to feel demoralized, to say, oh, look at this, look at the other party, look at that, I can't believe people voted this way, I can't believe that politician is saying that. But that's always been the case. It's all democracy is oftentimes an ugly process. We talk about Twitter and Facebook today, but even back then, the stuff that people would write about each other in their pamphlets. I mean, many of y'all have seen Hamilton. That's based on reality. Like, they were writing sordid things about each other to spread truths and stretch of the truths. But the system that was created seems to have lasted. And, I do think it is based on the fact that the United States, even back then, was one of the more educated countries in the world, that it has invested in mass public education, which also has not been perfect. But that, I think, has been the underlying bedrock that has, and our education has improved over time. Once again, we can always point to places where it's weak and it's unequal. But I think that's the thing that's allowing us to get to become a better country over time. And I think, if when you look year to year or election cycle, you can say, oh, I don't know if that was a forward move, or I don't know if that was. But if you even look at decade to decade, it's hard to look, especially if you look at, every 20 years or 30 years, it's hard to look at a time where we are not progressing generally, especially I would say in the last century. So yeah, I think they did. In software world, if you write code that lasts 10 years, that's impressive. They wrote code that's lasted, 230 something years.
I love your optimism and your devotion to the Constitution, and you're reminding us how remarkable it is that it's endured and that it did indeed prevail over the past years and weeks in such a significant way. If let's think through during the past week which institutions were tested and how they performed, and then I'm going to ask you if we had to shore up the guardrails, what would you choose to focus on? So first, we saw the judiciary in a very nonpartisan way. 59 out of 60 lawsuits rejecting false claims of electoral fraud. We saw state election officials resisting importunations of the president to corruptly find non-existent votes, even though that they acted according to their institutional roles. We saw the vice president of the United States who made a big decision. The president was telling him to overturn votes on his own, and he read the Constitution, the Article 2 and the 12th Amendment, and concluded he had no authority to do that, and his role was purely ministerial. That was very important. And then there was this really significant decision that Congress made, ultimately rejecting by an overwhelming vote in the Senate of more than 90 to 6 or 7, and by a less overwhelming majority in the House, rejecting efforts to repudiate electoral votes in Arizona and Pennsylvania. When we review that list, should anything be refined? Would you want to make it clearer in the Constitution that Congress doesn't have a substantive role to play and that it has to certify the votes? Would you want to change the system so that we had a national popular vote with a clean winner, as some liberals and conservatives have proposed? Or as you think about possible reforms, what, if any, guardrails need to be strengthened?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think, you talk about these, strong majorities in Congress that, certified the vote. I think even the people who voted, to not certify or who wanted to repudiate it in some way, they were just doing a political calculus because they knew that they were in a minority. And so at the time, they said, okay, if I want to, I want to ride on the coattails of the president. I don't want the president to go after me. And I know my vote's not going to matter because I'm going to be in the minority. So let me do that. I think that's the calculus. I think even, some of the folks that you mentioned, highly educated, I think if they thought that their vote would have a chance of overturning the vote, I'd like to believe that they would not have done that. That would have sobered them up. Now, with that said, what they did is still damaging because it creates an air of that people will distrust what was actually an incredibly sound process. For me, I think it would be a fun debate to, whether you have a popular vote for things like the president and things like that versus the electoral college. It's an interesting, as someone who lives in California, I would like my vote. I would like my vote to count more, so to speak, proportionately. But, at the end of the day, I don't think our system is super broken there. I think and for the most part really works. I think what this has shown us, and then, the last election cycle, kind of this foreign intervention type of stuff, I think we need to maybe make more transparent how does the process work? As all of this got into the news and I started to learn, I didn't even really know, how do they count the votes and how do they know that it's, and when I started, I was like, okay, this is an incredibly robust process. Like I was, and you have observers from both sides and they're able to see, and it's an impressive process. I think if most Americans really understood that process, once again, it doesn't have to be like, they don't have to take a course in it, but if it was just surfaced better in the media, that would build trust. And then also the robustness of it versus, kind of foreign intervention, the fact that there's a paper trail, things like that. I think those are the types of things that are valuable, in any open source system, in software world, if everyone knows the code, it actually becomes safer because it's, there's more good people than bad in the world. And the good people are more likely to discover the gaps first and then tell you about it. And so I think, once again, kind of the code of how we do elections, et cetera, we should make that as transparent as possible so that collectively we know, are there any kind of backdoor areas? Are there any parts? And then, but for the most part, it'll build confidence in what we have. But I don't feel a strong urgency that I don't think it's an emergency that we have to, rethink the electoral college or anything like that. If I was a purist, it would be a really interesting conversation.
Wonderful. Such an important reminder about the close connection between transparency and trust in institutions. And it was indeed the transparency that allowed courts to reject the challenges, and election officials to stand by their counts, and citizens ultimately to, overwhelming majority of citizens to accept the results, although we do still see that there are large percentages of the country that believe that the election was flawed. That leads to the question of disinformation on social media, conspiracy theories. We saw this week that Facebook and Twitter's decision to pause the president's accounts had a bigger effect on his ability to speak than anything that the government should do. They're non-state actors, of course, but living in the Valley, you're well aware of this debate about the role of the platforms in filtering speech that could either incite violence or hate or disinformation. Any thoughts? How do you think the platforms are doing? And in this regard, specifically with regard to the president's inciting speech, and could they do better?
Yeah, this was an incredibly hard issue. And I don't envy, the folks at Facebook or Twitter or YouTube on how you figure this out, because absolutely, if you're Twitter or your Facebook, and if someone is posting, just as it is illegal, you can say what you want, you have freedom of speech, but you can't yell, famously, fire in a crowded theater. That people will die because of that. They'll trample each other, etc. So that's bad. And similarly, you should be able to tweet what you want, but if you're going to tweet stuff that is in a not so subtle way undermining the government, or it's you're trying to create insurrection, or you're trying, like, these things should be questioned. You need some guardrails, and especially if it's just outright lies and misinformation. And the between opinions, in theory, you should be able to do, but then if it's an outright lie and that things get blurred between those two, the question, and I've put myself in this, it's a fun kind of intellectual exercise when you're hanging out with your friends. What would you do? Mm-hmm. And I encourage all the students listening, literally next time you're hanging out with your friends, say, what would you do if you were Twitter or Facebook? Because there's one side where you say, oh, well, I would clamp down on this stuff, and I would, have fact checkers, but then who are the fact checkers? And how do you clamp down on it? And if you clamp down on it, is it going to make the followers of whoever you clamp down all of a sudden say, oh yeah, that person was probably lying? No, they're not going to do that. They're going to get even angrier. They're going to say, oh, the QAnon conspiracy theory is true. It's so true that the New World Order is in charge of our social media. We should be skeptical of all of this. And, frankly, and this is happening, they're going to create a new social media platform that's less scrupulous about all of this. So it is a really fascinating question. And we're even putting aside the fact that there's a lot of really positives about social media. I've connected with family and friends that I hadn't seen in decades, but there's a whole other dimension of people getting worked up, getting paranoid, getting depressed, getting anxious through social media, feeling insecure. And I think these things are all related.
You're so right that it is the hardest question in thinking about free speech, for just the reasons that you said. Even though the platforms are not state actors, they have so much influence over speech, and just seeing the way that inciting speech spread like a virus over social media makes us realize that Madison, in some ways, was too optimistic that the large size of America would make it difficult for mobs or factions to mobilize. He thought because it was hard to organize, by the time they found each other, they'd peter out and go home. But now that people can instantly find each other and can talk only to each other and spread conspiracies online, we've seen this week that can quickly move offline into real space, and how to balance the need to have complete freedom of speech and only to suppress speech when it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, which is the threat for incitement, which we put in the chat box, but also to prevent the tinder from burning before it's too late is a really tough one.
Well, one thing I will throw out that I do think these social media or tech companies do have a responsibility right now. All of their platform, most of them make money on ads, which is fine. But the way they make money is by having more and more engagement. The eyeballs spend longer on these sites, and they have these machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms that keep testing. Okay, what's going to engage Jeffrey? And if it's more likely to engage Jeffrey, Sal's like Jeffrey, I'm going to give it to Sal too. And so you have these algorithms that are constantly trying to pull you into these rabbit holes. And you know, no one designed that. No engineer wrote, let's pull people into rabbit holes. But they said, hey, present people with information that they're more likely to click on, more likely to engage with. But the side effect of that has been, you know, I'll give one example. I remember, you know, I leverage YouTube heavily. I uploaded videos for Khan Academy about Islam, you know, just like the history, kind of a scholarly view of, you know, the historical events of Muhammad's times, what Muslims believe, what they don't believe, you know, and it was part of a series on general world religions. I did Christianity, I did Hinduism, I did Judaism, and the video, you know, on YouTube, but then I saw what was being recommended next to it. And almost every video that was being recommended, it took you into one of two rabbit holes, either a rabbit hole of kind of almost a more extreme form of Islam rabbit hole, or a rabbit hole of kind of hatred of Islam. And even though, you know, most of the world is in neither of those rabbit holes, those are both extreme cases. That's the rabbit hole it was taking in. And, you know, the YouTubes of the world, social media has discovered that there are these kind of unusually charismatic and mesmerizing people who can engage you. I mean, I've clicked on some of these people and you're looking at them like, oh, maybe they're right. And I'm like, wait, what am I doing? This person is but the machine learning algorithm doesn't care. They present it to people. And if I'm almost getting, you know, seduced by this video for 30 seconds, imagine if you're a 13-year-old at home. Imagine if you don't have Jeffrey Rosen to talk to and remind you what reality is.
Just finished.
Very, very hard. So I think there might be some regulation of how these machine learning algorithms work, because they are messing with people's minds.
That's a very powerful suggestion. I guess Facebook is already talking about privileging reliable news sources over less reliable ones. It raises tough questions. You've got to have editors deciding what's reliable and what isn't. But you are suggesting that a sort of thoughtful intervention about what the recommended links are on the major platforms might have some role in combating conspiracy theorists and mob thinking, and that could be a really helpful First Amendment project. Kristen writes, she really wants to endorse a series of pro-democracy reforms. I would leave the House at 2 and maybe lower the Senate to 4 years. Among other things, I'm sorry, our democracy is getting less democratic. The Senate's a huge part of that. The Electoral College and gerrymandering is the other piece. Finally, we need to extend the size of the Supreme Court and implement a retirement age or a maximum number of justices. I read a great Atlantic article, No Other Western Democracy Allows This. It was brilliant. What is America not democratic enough, and should we be more democratic?
You know, once again, I think it's an interesting debate. You know, I think the notion of incumbency and term limits is a really interesting one. I've heard good arguments on both sides. You know, personally, I probably do lean a little bit more on the term limit size. And, you know, not only, you know, once incumbent is there, they're infamously hard to remove, but also, you know, the power in Congress is seniority based because of how, you know, things are, you know, positions are doled out in the various caucuses. So yeah, I find that intriguing. You know, I'll throw out even once again, I don't know if this is a good idea, but just in the you know, if we had to rethink, if we were doing a constitutional convention today, you know, is it good or bad for the Congress people to have to meet physically? The good, one could argue, is that, you know, behind closed doors, they can kind of turn off their demagoguery and be humans to each other and kind of say, okay, I know I said that thing on stage, but I don't really believe it. I had to get reelected, but now let's compromise. I've heard that said, and then maybe they can connect and they can bond. But then the other, and you know, people have heard this forever, especially in the last several decades, is they get disconnected from, you know, because they're in DC, they get disconnected from their base. A lot of folks, you know, kind of want to be there and they get seduced by the power of being physically there. And, you know, who are they surrounded by? There's a whole multi-billion-dollar industry of lobbyists, and it makes life really easy for the lobbyists to put all of the power in one place physically, and you know, and take all the Congress people out to restaurants and golfing and whatever else. So, you know, look, COVID has showed us that you can do stuff on Zoom, and honestly, you can do things much more transparently on Zoom. And then, you know, I could imagine if you don't get kind of the fancy office in the Capitol building and this and that, and frankly, you could probably get a more talent pool. There's probably people who, if if being a congressperson did not require you to move to DC, like, okay, I could do that. I could be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, but I could be a congressperson simultaneously because it happens on Zoom. If you look at the hours of the actual voting responsibilities, actually, it could be a part-time job. It's just the full-time job is when you're hanging out with the lobbyists and everything else. So, and campaigning, which obviously you would have to do. So I think there's some interesting models of leveraging technology so that, some of what is perceived as whatever you want to call it, the swamp or et cetera, it gets a little bit more decentralized.
That's such an interesting suggestion, and it would be in the spirit of the founder's idea that being a representative was not a full-time job. The original First Amendment, which we can display at the National Constitution Center because we have one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights, wasn't the free speech amendment. It would have required one representative in Congress for every 30,000 inhabitants. There'd be 6,000 people in Congress today if that had passed. But that's because they really wanted to make sure that the representatives were close to their constituents in just the way that you suggested. And a Zoom Congress would help you do that. On the other hand, I should share, our former chair at the Constitution Center was President-elect Biden. He was our chair before, just until last year. And he told the story of how the Senate used to be totally different because senators of different parties stayed in Washington over the weekend and they would have lunch with each other every day. And once you get to spend 10 years listening to a segregationist from the other side of the aisle or someone who totally disagrees with you and hear about their families and their problems, you can actually empathize with them and engage in compromise and be more moderate. So there are pluses and minuses to face-to-face deliberation. Alexandra Kendrick asks, one of my students would like to know what inspired Saul to start Khan Academy.
Oh, well, I've always been fascinated by education. I mean, if you look at any issue in the world, I mean, today we're talking about democracy and how nations are formed. If you look at any issue, economic disparities, if you look at, gender disparity, if you look at, almost any issue, if you really peel the onion of what is causing it, it usually does boil down to education of some way, shape, or form. And it's also no coincidence that the first countries that became, had a large broad-based middle income, were the first to industrialize, were the ones that took a bet on a large mass free public education. This is the US, this is the UK, it is kind of early Germany under Prussia, when it was Prussia, it was Japan in the 19th century. And those were literally the first to not only become powerful, but even more importantly, to have a more equal society. By no stretch of the imagination equal, but more equal and have a broad middle class. So I've always been fascinated by that. I've also always been fascinated by maybe technology could play a role in really leveling the playing field. And, it wouldn't be only technology. I would never do technology for technology's sake. I always think the human element's the most important. But by random career choices, I was in tech, then I was an analyst at a hedge fund, which is kind of an investment firm with flexibility is one way you could think about it. My cousin, I was 28, she was 12 at the time, needed help. And she was in New Orleans, I was in Boston. So I started tutoring her remotely. And I wanted to do it to help her, but I just enjoyed teaching and learning. And then I was also just wanted to see, okay, if I could help her, and then it worked. Then I started tutoring her younger brothers, then word spread in my family, free tutoring was going on. And I started finding myself with 10, 15 cousins, family friends. And then I started writing software for them. I was like, okay, I got 15 cousins. How do I manage this while I have a day job? I was an analyst at an investment firm. And then when it started working for my cousins, I was like, there's no reason why I can't work for other people. And I just happened to, it was YouTube videos. There was a software practice piece. Other people who weren't my cousins were using it. And that's when I said, hey, at that time in like 2008, there's probably about 10,000 people using it. In 2009, about 20, 30,000 people, 40, 50 actually by 2009. I was like, if 50,000 people are using it now, there could be a world where one day it could be 50 million or one day it could be 5 billion people. And that's when I sat down with my wife. We looked at our finances. We were trying to save up for a down payment on a house. But we said, hey, if I set this up as a not-for-profit, which means no one owns it, this is kind of like the National Constitution Center. We're trying to build an institution that could serve humanity. And it was delusional. I was operating in a walk-in closet and living off of savings at the time. But my wife agreed that it looked like that there was something here. And so, that first year, whenever you do anything entrepreneurial, you're always a little bit more optimistic than you should be. I got a lot of no's, a lot of lack, but by 2010 we got our first philanthropic donors, and then that's what allowed us to create this. And I'm a big believer, as far as we know, we only have one life to live. And so if you have an opportunity to do something, try to swing for the fences, and try to think like the founders of this country. They were swinging for the fences. I mean, for them to kind of completely reimagine a new type of government, that is bold. I mean, today we talk about Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. That's up there. That's probably bigger. I mean, that's huge. That's bigger than the iPhone, so to speak. And so, I've always been inspired by that. And I said, wouldn't it be incredible? And I read a lot of science fiction. Wouldn't it be incredible if we could create an institution that could serve humanity, that could be this kind of bedrock that anyone on the planet could have access to education? And you've asked a question that has kind of gotten me talking, but I'll give one example that I've always inspired by. I don't know how many of y'all have read the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov.
Oh yeah.
But in that, the protagonist is kind of this psychologist, mathematician, statistician, and he's able to predict that the galactic empire, which is, the entire galaxy, it's been going strong for 30,000 years, is about to go into a dark age that will last for 10,000 years. And a dark age is fragmentation, there's famine, there's loss of knowledge, there's wars. And he decides to do something about it. His math and his psychology shows that he could shorten that dark ages by 9,000 years. So it'll still happen, but it'll only be 1,000 years. If he can collect the galaxy's knowledge and put it into a foundation at the periphery of the galaxy. And I remember reading that when I was in middle school, when I was many of your ages, and I'm thinking, that's epic. Like, how many people think on the scale of 1,000 or 10,000 years? And then also Harry Seldon, the protagonist of that book, was right. If you can collect the knowledge and make it always accessible, this is kind of this fail-safe, this bulwark against falling into a deep dark age. It's actually everything we've just talked about. So anyway, that was the inspiration.
So inspiring. Thanks to Alexandra Kendrick Student for asking, and your vision of an educational institution that will serve humanity is vindicated by the remarkable academy that you've created, and it will indeed live on for eternity in spreading light and wisdom. I want to ask you if I can brainstorm with you about how the National Constitution Center can serve our unique role as part of that vision in being an educational institution in the Constitution that will serve humanity and reach as many people for free as possible online. And we've done these free videos together, and we're going to do more. And then we're offering now the classes that you're participating in now, and we're so grateful to our phenomenal students for joining, from middle and high school students. We're thinking now that it might be urgently important to offer free constitutional classes for learners of all ages, including adults. And starting later in January, we're thinking of powering up the Zoom and starting a new class, Constitution 101 for America, where I'll just go online once a week and answer folks' constitutional questions. There's so much that's arising in the news, from the 25th Amendment to the nature of impeachment this week to something else next week. So if you were, I'm asking for your advice as we design this, if you were designing a course, and I think it might be a live course, to just spread as much light and reach as many people as possible about current constitutional questions, how would you do it?
It's a good question. I take everything I say with a grain of salt, but I think the types of conversations we're having right now are really powerful ones. Where I could imagine, especially if you're doing a live course, you can leverage Khan Academy or online type of mechanisms to, so for people to know some of the core context and facts and ideas. But then it really starts to sink in if, let's say, you're on a Zoom call and you're able to go into a breakout session with 4 or 5 folks, and you have to answer the question, like, what would you do to curtail, misinformation? And have a debate with 4 or 5 folks, all who are equipped, and have a nice, respectful debate about that. And then, have another question, how would you, if we were a constitutional convention today, what would your group of 5 put as your top agenda for reforming or amending the current Constitution. I think all of that would be really interesting. I think another thing to think about, actually, we should think about this,
Yeah.
maybe after this.
Yeah.
All the time, there's a whole, civics is actually one of these core, areas, and the Constitution that was like, oh, everyone should know about this. But unless there is an extrinsic motivator, I think the people who are watching today, y'all are the future, scholars of the world, because by definition, you're coming here, even though no one is, you're coming here out of curiosity, which is great. But we know that sometimes you need other motivations. Hey, if you do this, you can get credit, you can get a job, you can get that. So I think that's something interesting for us to explore of, if someone can get a certificate saying, yeah, I know, I've this subject domain, I think that could be really powerful. Then we convince employers that, like, this is something that you want to index on, because one, it shows that they know the system that we're in, but it also shows that they have critical thinking, that they have a good knowledge base, they can communicate, which is frankly what you need for most jobs. Then I think it'll pull more people into learning about the Constitution and civics, even if they weren't initially motivated to do so.
That's a superb idea. And I'm going to take you up on your offer, and let's follow up on that. Wouldn't it be exciting? We could use the Khan Academy NCC videos as the curriculum, and I can teach it live, and we can have breakout sessions and think about offering a certificate. And we already have an attendee saying, can you please do Constitution 101 for ELLs, middle school through adults, please? I think this could be really exciting, and let's take advantage of this moment to continue to talk about it. We need to wrap up in a moment. The chat box is absolutely on fire, so there's so many questions, but I think that I'd better ask you what thoughts you want to leave our friends with about what we've learned about the Constitution in the past weeks and why it is so important to study it.
Well, as we said before, it's worth being optimistic, because as troubling as what we saw on the news 2 days ago, our institutions held, and they're holding more clearly than any time I've seen in the last several years, where people are putting finally country and Constitution before kind of ego and party. So I take a lot of positive stock in that. I think, this theme that education it really, as institutions exist in our minds, and obviously the best way of making sure that we have really strong minds is through education. So, this is that's kind of bedrock for everything. I just looked at the message boards. I mean, some of them reminded me, we talked about getting a certificate in like civics. One, I would love, when I went to vote, instead of seeing whether someone's a Democrat or Republican next to their names, I'd rather see whether they've like gotten the certificate from the National Constitution Center in civics. That's what I would love to see. I just want, they don't have to get 100%. Just, they know this, they know probably that. And like, do they understand like statistics and critical thinking? Like, honestly, I would always vote for whoever's doing better. I mean, maybe on certain issues, I would care about their but I'm always a fan of the person who can think the issues through and has a deep respect for our institutions and our Constitution. But I encourage everyone here. Once again, the country is not a bunch of marble white buildings in DC. The country is what's going on in your minds, and so you have a position and a responsibility to build up what's going on between your ears. And I always even point, even our brains are in our mind. If you really think about it, everything's in our mind. Jeffrey, you're in my mind right now, but like, I don't want to get too philosophical. But also then spread that. Oftentimes we draw the boundary between our inner thoughts and our external world. But I think, social media and everything shows us how porous thoughts are, and how I am creating thoughts in Jeffrey's mind and in all of your minds, and you're creating thoughts in our minds. And so we really do have a responsibility also to help build the tools in everyone we know. And if we do so, I'm very, very optimistic that America will continue to be kind of the lighthouse that it has been for the last several hundred years.
Sal, your optimism, your passion, and your vision of the truth that the Constitution is what's in our mind, and freedom is what's in our mind, is centrally important. This is what the founders said again and again. John Locke said that all of our ideas are based on our sensations and our reflection and what our minds do with the external sensations that come in from outside. And that is why we have it within our minds to govern our passions with reason or to succumb to unreasonable passions. And it's so exciting to talk to people like you, educational visionaries, who set our minds on fire by inspiring us with a passion of learning and filling our minds with light. So it's always great to talk. I'm really looking forward to our follow-up about Constitution 101. And on behalf of all of our students, thank you so much for joining the National Constitution Center's Constitution class.
Great. Thanks for having me. This is always a treat when I get to chat with you, Jeffrey.
Likewise. Thanks, friends. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Look forward to it. Bye.
There.